What'd you say? We should do pasta. All right, guys, how are we doing today? Good? Yes, this is more exciting CSS today. What do we think of yesterday? Good? Relatively good pace?
Super quick, please ask me or Leo before the end of class. It's not embarrassing, it's just quicker for everybody. Just ask us if you have questions.
Boom, right there, you read my mind. Colin, Leo, and Amanda are here. One, because they love listening to my voice and to hear and to learn about CSS, but two, and the main reason is to help you. So if you have questions during class, like during this hour, if something's not working, a setting's not right, don't wait until the end. Either PM them on Slack, raise your hand, they'll come over to you. That's one of the benefits of coming in person. So make sure to take advantage of that. I also wanted to start off with a quick note from yesterday. So one of the things that some of you ran into while we were starting to work on the index.html page was that if you were in Safari and you tried to set the height property on your select tag, it wasn't working. And I can actually show this. I had this pulled up. So this is where we left off yesterday. And this is the same page in Chrome over here. And you'll see that in Chrome, the height looks perfectly fine aligned with the go button. And in Safari, it's not. And so the reason behind this is a little complicated, but it has to do with how browsers render CSS. Chrome and Safari use different engines to actually render the CSS. And so what Safari's trying to do is it's trying to take the macOS default select native UI from your operating system and make it look like that on the web page, whereas Chrome is not. And so that's why when you try and apply the height, it just continues to look like the native macOS select button. And so when an issue like this happens, right, where something's not behaving as you would expect, one of the most important things to be able to do is to troubleshoot. So a lot of development is troubleshooting, and I know that I think I want to incorporate more into the rest of this class too, is teaching how to troubleshoot. That's a huge part about being a good developer. Even if it doesn't look like it looks like it's relatively polished if we're just demoing how to do something, mistakes come up all the time. So, for example, there were a couple of you after class yesterday where like if we ran into this issue where for some reason the select tag isn't the height that we want to, if you just type into Google like CSS select Safari height not working, something like that. Stack Overflow is generally going to be one of the first things to pop up about why. And so I'll usually just click like the first link that makes sense and I'll read through it and I'll see if it makes sense and helps me troubleshoot my problem. So can't change select height. Look, this looks right. Okay, this says try adding this. Okay, so I can come in here. Let's try adding this. So if I copy and this checkbox underneath the 30, so 37 means this got 37 upvotes on Stack Overflow. The check means the person that originally asked the question said that yes, this was the correct answer. And so if I came in here and I come over to the index.css file we were working on yesterday, and I add this into my select, and I save, and I have live server running, we can see that that did fix our problem. Now it looks like the same height, but now you notice that it also looks a little janky because it's like a gradient background. So what I would do is I'd come back over to Chrome, and I'd say, okay, that's kind of what I wanted, but not really. And this is suggesting to do a WebKit appearance none. So let me try that. Let's see. And I save, and I come back. That looks much more like what I wanted to get. So it's this process of trial and error. And like, by no means do I know every CSS property ever. If something's not working how I want it to work, Google's the first place I'll go. But the reasoning is because browsers render CSS differently, so it's just something to keep in mind. Okay. So let's continue working from yesterday. Anyone here not here yesterday? Okay, so what I've gone ahead and done is on the GitHub repo, if you go into, let's go into the GitHub repo and come into here, and then into intermediate 3.2, there's the zip file, and this zip file contains all of the code we worked on yesterday. You can just click on it and download raw. What I'll also do is I'll just send this in the Slack. So that's the progress that we made yesterday. Okay, couple things that I want to just touch on really quickly. So we have, this is the mini project. If we come, I personally like using Chrome. That's just like my preferred browser. The one thing that I wanted us to clean up from yesterday on here is that we noticed that there's this scrolling, right? Where in reality, we don't really need this whole page to like scroll. We kind of just want this background image to be pinned to like the bottom left corner, right? So what's happening right now is the browser is treating this image as like a big thing that we need to scroll down. And instead, we want to change that behavior a little bit to where it's always just pinned to the very bottom of the screen. And we do this using an attribute called position. At first, I was hesitant to kind of show position because you can get into really bad practices of positioning stuff using position. It's kind of counterintuitive. A lot of times you don't want to use that. Quick question for those of you that were here yesterday, what do you mainly want to use to position stuff? Anybody?
Flex.
Yes, Flexbox. Definitely much better way to position things. But what position is used for? And so what I'm going to demonstrate here is if we come in and target, I added an ID of bg-world on the index.html page. If we add a position attribute of absolute, what this is going to do is let us specify a top, right, left, or bottom position. So you can do any two of those four, I guess. So what I want to do is I want to set a bottom of 0, and I want to set a left of 0. And what this says, if I come back in here, is it's going to position this image 0 pixels away from the bottom and 0 pixels away from the left. So it's going to be at the very bottom left corner. What position absolute does is you can think about this as it removes it from the natural flow of the other elements. And so now we notice that there's no scroll on the right side because when this scroll happens, it's treating it as though this absolute positioned element isn't something that needs to be like part of that scroll tree, if that makes sense. It's just kind of there on the page. You can kind of think about this as in the eyes of the browser, this doesn't have like a real height in a sense, it's just there. This can get really tricky if you're like, you don't want to absolute position a lot of things because this can get really messy with how non-absolute position things render themselves and where they're put on the page. But for something like this, where we just want to put it in the left-hand corner, this will suffice. And so now we can see that this is always, that's how it's positioned. Question?
Could you go back to the code for a second?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Another quick thing, so right now, this image is its direct parent. So this, okay, quick quiz question. What is image's direct parent tag? Yeah, it's just the body. It's not nested inside of anything, right? So the absolute position is in relation to the closest parent that has a position relative applied. And so what I mean by that is a lot of times, let's say like you want to absolute position something, but like relative to another item, right? So this is a little bit of a deviation here, but I think it's worth demoing. So if I just do a class of cont, and I'm going to put this image inside of here. And then I'm going to give this container a background of green, let's just say. And I'm going to save that. Okay, it's because this, so this is actually a good demonstration too. We don't see any green, right? Why is that? Why don't we see any green?
Is the image taking up that where the green would be?
I think it's because we gave position absolute. So this is what I was talking about when I said it kind of like removes the height, so to speak, of it. In this case, it was not taking up any space on the actual tree. What I want to demonstrate here is if I give this a width of 50% and I give it a, so this is another trick that you can do. This div is now taking up half the screen width, right? It's not inside of anything that's flexed, but let's say we want to center this div, right? There's a neat little trick that you can use with margin left and right. So if you set margin left to auto, this is going to push it all the way to the right. And if you set margin right to auto, and they're both set to auto, this will actually center it. Okay, so now if we were to re-put this position absolute on this background, the image, it's not going to do anything, real. Like you're not going to be able to tell again that the container was there because this removes that height element from the green background, and it just kind of disappears. If we were to add a position relative onto this and save, we're going to see that weird things start to happen because it's now being positioned relative to that container element, and that the green container actually is starting right here. So like you could think about it, it has 0 height. So I think if I were to add a height of, let's just say 100 pixels. Now we can see it if we hard code the height, but it's saying don't use those pixel numbers bottom and left in relation to the body. Use it in relation to this parent container because it's the parent that has relative positioning. So I think this is also demonstrating my point of why you don't really want to use this kind of positioning that much because it gets messy really easily. But that was a quick digression, but I will remove this container and I will remove it from the HTML. And I hope everyone can see now why, kind of the dangers of using absolute positioning, but also for something like this where we want it just in the corner, it makes sense.
You said that the parent of the image as you had it there was the body. Why is it not the outer div for content?
That div ends above the image. So if I hover over line 31, it's highlighting the div in line 15 as like the matching. Okay. Yeah, it should be outside that div. If it was inside the div, then the direct parent would be content. Okay, so that's all from this page. Now let's move into the more difficult page. And I'm not gonna blaze through this, but I'm gonna go a little bit faster because there's a lot to do here. So I think the biggest important thing is I'm just gonna try and expose as many new attributes and a better repeated idea of how to use Flexbox. So if I pull up the Figma that we want to reference, this is what we're trying to create, our blueprint, and this is the flight.html file. I made sure to copy over the Google fonts to this new HTML, by the way. If that's not in yours, make sure those 3 links that we added yesterday are in. And then we also have the flight.css file linked in the flight.html, but it's completely empty, so there's no styles. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and add a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 and a font family of the man-rope family that we're importing from Google Fonts to everything. This is just kind of like a baseline to work from. I talked about yesterday, best practice. This will remove a lot of confusion about margin and paddings if you just default set all of them to 0 and then override as we go. Next thing that we want to do is we want to look at the nav bar. So what this is going to be is this is its own inside of content. So there's an enclosing content div around everything. And then there's also a nav bar a container div. And so if I do a nav bar and I'm just going to do a display of flex direction row, this property is not required. One best practice is to put it just so it's easier to read. It'll default to row, but I like to put it just to make sure I know what it's doing. I want to make sure the items are aligned center, so that cross-axis we talked about yesterday. And then I actually want to do justify content start. And what this is going to do is now it's all the way to the left of that enclosing div. The reason I added a content container for the div is we don't want this to go all the way to the edge of the screen, but if we look at the mockup, instead of adding like a width or a margin left to every single element here, it makes more sense just to add an enclosing div and put a margin left on the whole thing. A nice trick to do that we're going to get into responsive design at the end of today is you'll want to give a pretty big width, let's say like 95%, and this is where you're going to do the margin left auto, margin right auto. So this will say, like, this will give it a 95% width, and if I add a background color of orange, I'll use like bright colors just to visualize. We see that that's centered on the page, but we can also add a max width of, let's just say, like 1500 pixels, and this will actually bring it in a little bit, but if we resize the window, we'll see that eventually it'll grow to that 95%. This is what I talked about yesterday with giving widths to things. Okay, so the nav bar is aligned flex. We also, on this nav bar image, we aren't going to want the width to be probably more than, let's just say, 50 pixels. That's looking better. And on this whole nav bar, we want to add a margin top to it. So I'm going to add let's just say 100 pixels. That looks like a little much. Let's try 50. That looks a little bit better if we come back to the mockup. I actually think this 50 pixels might be a little much, so I'm going to bring it down to 40. And then I also want to give this margin right, let's just say 15 pixels as a guess, and come over here, and that looks about right for the nav bar. Okay, so the nav bar is looking good. Next thing we want to do is if we look at the HTML structure, I structured this into a left and a right div enclosed in a main dash container. Now this is a trick I was talking about, spacing things left and right on a page. Anybody have an idea of what I'm going to want to do with this main container? Just shout it out. Any ideas? How am I going to get the left and the right sides in this main container to be next to each other? I'm going to use display flex. When in doubt, display flex. This is also going to be in a row orientation. If I come over and save, we'll see that everything on the right, so what's on the right here is just the image of this top of the plane, and then all of these, we'll get into all these different like seats and stuff, but this is basically the content of the plane visualization on the right. Okay, so now we have left and right. Now we can target specifically the left. And so the thing that I immediately notice on this mockup is that the left takes up the majority of the screen. So I'm just going to say, let's just set this width to maybe 60%. And just see how this looks. That's looking fairly good in my opinion. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that there's enough spacing in between the top of this content and this nav bar. So I could add a margin bottom to the nav bar, or I could also add a margin top to this left container. I'm going to opt for a margin top on the left container because we want this plane visualization to extend pretty much up to that nav bar. And so I'm going to add a margin top on left of, let's just say, 40 pixels. Coming back over to see how I structured this, there's a left, and then this left top div is what actually contains this section in this HTML, in the mockup. And so here, what we're going to want to do is on the left top, there's not a lot on just the left top that we're going to want to do because the showing flight route, we don't want row aligned, right? That's column. Do you have a question?
Yeah, wait, like where are you getting like the name left top from?
So this is just in the HTML what I've given the class names to.
Oh, okay.
So that's completely arbitrary. I just made it left top. You could make it any name, any string you want. This is just what I named them. Any other questions? Okay, so there's nothing really here on the actual left top that we need to modify. The one thing we do want to change is this H6. It's not the right size and it's not like a lighter font. If I come in here, I'll see that in my mockup, gave it a size 16 font and thin. And so if I come back here and I do a font size of 16 pixels and a font weight of 200, not on left top, but on the H6 tag, and I come save, that's going to look more correct. The thing that I'm really interested in is this left dash top dash route. I named that this other enclosing div. And I want to give it a flex direction of display flex, flex direction row, make sure the items are centered, and I'm going to give it a little margin away from the showing flight route. Okay, we're in business. What I also noticed is in this left top route, the H3 tags with the airports, we want these fonts to be big. I'm going to guess like 48 pixels. And also probably pretty bold. Let's see about 800. Let's see how that looks. That's looking much better. The other thing I think is pretty obvious is the image is way too big. And so inside of the image, let's give it a width of 24 pixels. Let's just try that. That looks pretty good. I think it could be a little bit bigger. And I also want to give it a margin left of maybe 20 pixels and a margin right of 20 pixels. Let's just see how this looks. That looks pretty good in my opinion. The other thing I wanted to show quickly, I'm not going to get into anything really advanced about this, is in the mockup, this plane was pointed like an arrow. There's a property called transform. So I'll show you in a second something I realized, and I'll ask anybody if they can spot what we're going to want to actually change about this selector here. But there's a property called transform, and what this can do is you can actually manipulate images and divs and whatnot. Like I said, I'm going to show the most basic thing that we can do is we can actually rotate this image 45 degrees. And what this is going to do is now it's going to take that image, turn it 45 degrees, so it looks like it's pointing directly to the right. So all that did is it just manipulated the logo in the top left corner, 45-degree rotation clockwise. Does anybody see the problem here? I'll stop for, what's the problem?
You rotated the others.
I did. I rotated the change route icon, and that's not what we wanted to do. And this is an example, I'm glad this came up, where I'll accidentally target something I wasn't wanting to change. Who has a solution? How can I fix this problem? Yeah?
Put an ID on it.
Yeah, great idea. So let's just put an ID on this image. What do you want the ID to be called? Plain. I love it. And instead of targeting this, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to target plain. Boom, fixed. I also noticed that I think that this, in general, is a little bit far away from the showing navigation, so I'm actually probably just going to remove this margin top of 5 pixels. Okay, now what we want to do is tailor this this button for change route. So I'm going to come in here, and I noticed it's just an A tag. Somebody shouted a name of a class they want to give this A tag. Anything? Somebody. I'll stand. Hit me with the name of a class. Any name you want. Pancake? All right, we'll name it Pancake. So the reason I asked for name of a class is we could have targeted this by .left top route A. Sometimes because we're going to also want to like add styles to the nesting things, it's really subjective over what you give a class or a name, or an ID, sorry, and what you just target based on the HTML tree path. Here what I'm gonna do is I added Pancake, so instead of having to type out dot left top route a image eventually, I can just type out dot pancake. And Pancake, we're gonna wanna make sure it's flexed because the items, the icon and the text are gonna be right next to each other. And we're gonna wanna make sure they're aligned center vertically. Okay, so this is getting us much closer to where we wanna be. We'll also notice that on Pancake, on the A tag, we wanna make sure it's spaced out a little bit away from the actual route information. We showed this yesterday, but we don't want any text decoration on that P tag based on our mockup. And we also want to add a border. So let's just add a border of 1 pixel, solid black. This is the syntax to add a border. I think this is new. So how it goes is 1 pixel is the weight of the border. Solid, there's like dashed. I think that's like the only other one I know, maybe dotted. Almost always you're going to use solid. And then the color. And so if I hit save and come back over here, now we can see this border around that element. What quiz question, CSS property do we want to use to add white space between this border and the content of the A tag? So what property, CSS property, do we add this space using? Not quite. Padding, yes. Rule of thumb, like let's say you thought it was margin, right? And you came in here and said, let's just add a margin of 10 pixels. We'll see it didn't do anything. So that's generally a pretty good way to know if something's behaving right or wrong. What we want to do is we want to add padding. Now I'm going to showcase something you probably will see at one point, right? So you know how they have padding top, padding left, padding right, padding bottom, like all 4 different properties? There's a little shorthand you can use. Sometimes I forget the order of this, but you can specify more than one value in padding itself. So if you were to specify, for example, 100 pixels, that's way too much, but that's going to add 100 pixels on every side, right? If we were to add 100 pixels and 10 pixels, this is going to say 100 pixels for top and bottom, 10 pixels for the sides. So if you specify 2 numbers for padding, it's going to say the first number's top, the second number's bottom. Or not bottom, excuse me, left and top and bottom, and then left and right. You can also do this with 4. So let's say I wanted to do 0 and then like 50 just to see if I can tell which side I'm using what. You can, I don't even feel like doing this right now, but basically you can set 4 different paddings in one line rather than having to do 4 different properties. The reason I bring this up is a very common styling thing you'll see is you want a slightly smaller top and bottom padding as opposed to left and right padding. So if I did something like 10 pixels, 20 pixels, that looks fairly close to what I'm looking for. I think this is more of a matter I want the text to actually be a little smaller.
Kind of going back to when you put the ID plane on one of the images, is that kind of acceptable if it's for sure just like one thing or a fixed number of things that you want to affect? Or if you have a lot of things, would it be better to tag it as a class rather than ID?
ID can only be used for one element.
One element.
Yeah, IDs are unique, classes aren't. We could have given it a dot plane. It would have done the same thing. We just chose to give it an ID because it was like the only thing on that HTML tree. Good question. Okay, and then what I want to do is inside of Pancake, I see that there's a P tag. I'm going to take this font size down to maybe 12 pixels. It was already at 12 pixels, so I'm going to take it down to 10 pixels. I spelled pancake wrong. Thank you. That was too small now, so I actually did want, I think, maybe 14 pixels. That looks pretty good. Let's say, and then I want a margin right on this text of maybe 10 pixels to separate that icon a little bit. That looks good. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to perfect the change route button, but that looks pretty good in my opinion. Okay, so that's looking pretty close, I would say, to the mock-up that we have here. Next thing we're going to want to tackle is this major box. And so in the HTML tree, what I call this is left.main. So it's always, a lot of times it's a good idea to give it a flex of column, even if we're still going to want to, like, even if we don't want to row flex it. It's just kind of a habit that I like to do because if everything's working in flex, generally good principle to do so. So I'm going to flex this as a column. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to add a margin top of, I'm going to guess maybe 200 pixels because we want this to be separated from the showing the flight route up top. We'll also notice that there's this like nice drop shadow on the box in the mockup, and how you do that in CSS is using the box shadow property. If I come into Figma, I can actually click, this is a little throwback from UI UX, but I can click on the drop shadow icon in effects. It'll show me the X and Y offset, it's called. So if I were to drag this, it would move it way over to the right. Similarly, the Y-axis, same thing. And then there's these two properties called blur and spread. I honestly don't really know a lot about how they work. I don't know the technical graphic design definition. But these four properties are the four things that you want to specify on the box shadow. So the first, and this is just going to, I'm going to use Copilot to help fill this in. First is X offset, second is Y offset, then it's blur, and then it's spread. So if I were to just take those same ones that we had from the mockup and set the RGB, A stands for, the A adds opacity to color. And if I came into Figma, we'd see that the color was set to black with a 25% opacity. So what this is going to do is it's going to add a little nice box shadow. And I come over here and I see that that's a very similar effect to what I was looking for in the mockup. It's now a little bit popping out of the screen. The other thing that this is going to, I just noticed now, is we're going to want to make sure, I think 50% instead of 60%, but we're going to want to add, let's just say a margin right of 10% to this. So now that is separated from the actual plain visual. This box is definitely going to want some padding. So I'm going to start, let's just say maybe 40 pixels is my guess. That looks pretty good. And the next thing we're going to want to do is start with the top. So left main top. So if I look at the mockup, the direct children are arranged in a row with space in between. So, and what I mean by that is this we set up as one div, and this text is one div as well. Or not a div, sorry, this is just an H tag. So if we give the left main top a display of flex it in a row, and we're going to justify the content space between. This is going to push each element as far away from each other as possible. Hit save. Now we can see that the four C is in the right corner, seat available, reserve the seat below is in the left corner. I'm going to add an ID on this seat of seat number, just because this could get kind of nested and it's very unique to what it's not going to be used anywhere else on the page. On seat number, we want the color. So this is a little bit tricky. If you want to set the font color, you might think it's like text color, font color. It's just color. That's what changes the font. We want this font to be white. And then if we come into the design, we added a little bit of unique color here. I'm just going to copy this hex code from Figma for the background. And you set this using the background color. So if I save and come back over, we now see that that's, it doesn't look great. Why does it not look great? Anybody? What else do we need to add to this 4C? Yeah, we do need to add padding. I would guess 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Not too bad. The one thing we need to add, though, on this top is an align items center. Because we could see that they weren't, I'll go back and illustrate this further. If this wasn't here and this background was orange, the seat available, reserve seat below, remember how align items are default set to stretch? So that container's stretching, but we want to make sure that those items are actually in the middle of it. And so instead, we're just going to set that to align items center. I think the text itself could also be a little bit bigger here. So I'm just going to add a font size of like 32 pixels. And then a little bit of a border radius. That might be a little big, 28 pixels. Okay, looking good. We also want to make sure that this font is big enough. I also noticed that this margin top on the left, this main box is too much. I'm going to change that from 200 to 100. And so the seat available, I'm going to target the H5 tag in the HTML right here, as well as the little sub tagline. I'm going to target that using .left, main top left, I called it. And here, I'm just going to specify the H5. Its font size in the mockup was 24. And its font weight, I think I gave it like 600 maybe. And in the Figma, the subtitle, I gave font size of 16 pixels and a font weight of 200. That looks better. Okay, we're moving. I'm going to come back to the inputs because I think now we got a good starting point, and styling the plane I think is a little bit more interesting. And I want to make sure we definitely get that done today. Okay, so for now, we see how this is coming together on the left. We will style the inputs in a little bit, but for now we're going to focus our attention to the plane. And so that's going to be in the right side of things. Okay, so the first thing that I want to get a grasp of is just how wide this is. So I'm going to give it a yellow background and just see. So that's the amount of space that it's taking up. I personally think that this is too big, especially compared to the mock-up. It doesn't look this wide. So I'm going to set its width, let's just try 30% and see how this looks. So that looks good, except we have a problem. What's the problem?
It's not like centered on the right side.
Well, the problem is the image is overflowing on the container it was given. So this image has a hard-coded pixel width, right? Whenever we export it from Figma as, we've set the div container to be a certain width, but that image width isn't being set. So it's just overflowing off the div that we set. The solution to this is just to give the image, and I give it an ID of plain top. Let's just give it a width of 100%. Now that's going to take up 100% of the parent width. And that's exactly what we want the behavior to be. The other thing that I'm going to do is in this main container, if we set a justify content space between, now it's going to actually move all the way over, like it's going to separate the left-hand side and the right-hand side and leave as much space in between here as possible. So now it's like you can think about this as like the plane is kind of like pinned to the right. Okay, so that looks good. The next thing we'll see what I did is I divided this in the HTML structure into plain rows, and then each row has two sides. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is the plain rows is going to be a display flex. And so if I just immediately save and come over here, that's strange. Okay, I don't really know why that. Oh, I think we're fine. If something doesn't work here in a minute, I'll figure out why. But then what I want to do is I also want to add, let's just say, for a plain side, a background of green. Let's just see what's going on here. Okay, yeah, they are next to each other. Sorry, I was having a brain fart for a minute. So they're just really skinny right now because it's only this is one side and DEF is another side. So we want each plain side, if we come back to the mockup, to take up almost the amount from the left and the right? Like there's just a little bit of a space for that aisle on the illustration of the plane. So let's say that I want the plane side to take up 40%. Let's just try this. Let's see how this looks. That looks pretty good, but then what we also realize is we want to do a justify content of space between on here, and I'm going to align items at the start. Now this isn't going to actually end up doing anything, except what we'll see happens is that since I just copy and pasted each side over, align item start is more of just a good practice to do because it's starting from the top and then going down. Okay, we're getting somewhere. We still don't see any seats, and we still don't have anything aligned properly. So what we're going to introduce is I'm going to take these backgrounds out because we don't need them. For a while, we've been using display flex, right? And flex is very powerful. However, if we want something to be in a grid, there's a nice property called display grid. And so what I'm going to do is apply this property to a plane side. And if we give it a display, instead of doing flex of grid, we can also set a property called grid template columns. And what this is going to do is it's going to let us say how many columns we want. And you might be tempted just to put 3 here. That's not what we want to do. We want to do 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. And what this means is this is a fractional unit. FR stands for fractional unit. And since they're all the same, they're each going to be the same width. If I come back over here, we'll see that these are all, now the ABCs are next to each other. And the EF is next to each other. This is what we want. This will be easier to visualize in a minute, but what I want to make sure we're doing here is we also want to align text to center. This is going to center all of the headers of the plane. And oftentimes it's better practice to put that text center actually in the tag that it's being centered on. And so I'm going to target the H5s, which are the header for each row, and I'm going to make them a little bit bigger. And I'm also going to make sure their text aligns centered. And this is centering them inside of their grid layout. It's a little confusing, I know. But if I add this and this and come back here, this is looking much closer to what we wanted. But we don't see any seats yet, right? That's kind of a problem. So I have given every seat, I've given every div on this tree a class of seat. So if I come into seat, and I'm just going to give it a background of blue, nothing happens. Why did nothing happen? Why did nothing happen? Yeah, there's nothing in the seat. So the browser sees this div, and they're like, but wait, there's nothing in there, and there's no CSS besides this background of blue, so it's not actually showing anything. What we want to do is we want to set a width. I think what we want to do, let me see if this is right, of 100%. It's not going to show anything. And if we just said if we wanted to set a height of 10 pixels, we're going to start to see seats. And what this has done is it just looks like 2 boxes right now, right? The problem is this is arranged in a grid of 3. So there's 3 columns here, 3 columns here. But there's no space in between each side of the grid. And what we want to do is we want to come into the grid and do a grid gap. Let's just say like 10 pixels. Now we're getting somewhere. So now we can see that now there's 10 pixels in between each grid on this plane arrangement. But we also don't want, so we have a problem. We don't want it to be only 10 pixels, but the width of this seat is dependent on the sizing of the plane, right? And so we want these to always be a square. And so what we're going to do is instead of setting a height, we're going to set an aspect ratio of 1/1. And what this is going to do is it's going to calculate the width of the div, and then it's going to give it an equal height. And so now it looks like a square, and we can see that if we were to resize, they stay square. We'll get into mobile stuff probably next week. I think we're going to run out of time today. Okay, but instead of having a blue background, I really just want most seats to have a border. Let's just say 1 pixel, solid black. Now this is looking very nice. Let's give each a little border radius. Okay. And then the other thing we did is we added this. So to add multiple classes to an HTML element, you just add a space. So this one we add selected to, right? And this happens to be seat 4C I calculated on the HTML stuff. Let's say I didn't add a check mark in, just for simplicity, but let's say we wanted to make this seat blue. I can click into this element. It's the same blue as this, actually. And if I copy this blue over, and for any class of selected, just give a background color of this, but make sure to include the hashtag. And I come back over here. Now that'll look different. The other thing we could do is, if we want to add like a taken class to some of these, right? How we had some of them like light gray. I'm just randomly giving these taken. We could add a little background color of maybe like, that'll show that they're taken. Okay, this is looking good. We got our plane looking like a plane. Let's tackle styling the inputs really quick, just so we don't leave this looking not too great. So going back over to the left, I called this enclosing div for the form left main form. And so what I like to do is kind of organize my CSS based on where it is in the HTML tree. So I'm scrolling back up into CSS and putting it right above where I started the right stuff. It doesn't really matter. This is more of an organizational thing. But I'm going to target the left main form. And here I want to make sure I'm doing a display of flex, and I'm flexing it in the column direction. And what this is going to do is it's going to make sure that they're all like so that I put the ones that I want to only take up half the width in their own div, so it's not, as we talked about, like nesting divs, that's ignored by the column, the flex column. But now the reserved seat is not right next to the button as it was before. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is really style the inputs. I'm going to show a nifty little CSS trick that we can do. So you know how all of these inputs have a type? What we can do is target all of the inputs with the type of text by using these little brackets right next to the input tag. And so what this is going to say is every input in the left main form class that has a type of text, and really we don't even need this type equal text, but let's say that there was like another input, for example, that was a submit input, right? It's different than a button. Or let's say it was something else. But for now, it doesn't matter if we have this or not. And I just want to make sure this is working correctly. If we give it a background of yellow and we come back, now we can see that all those inputs are yellow. Okay, so by the way, if anyone's wondering why I'm doing background yellow, it's to make sure that I'm targeting the correct element, right? Because this will debug a lot of problems if you know that you're targeting the right element and a CSS property isn't working, or if it's actually the CSS property itself that isn't working. There's been so many times where I've tried to like target or like style something, but it was because I had like misspelled a selector or it wasn't working, that I thought it was the CSS, but it was actually the selection. So this ensures that we've selected the right things. And if we look at how these are styled in the mockup, well, the first thing I notice is that there's a border. I'm going to give it a solid black border. I'm going to say the height I'm gonna guess was around 60 pixels. Let's see if that looks pretty good. I want to add some left padding to each. I'm gonna give it 10 pixels of left padding. That way the text isn't right next to it. And I'm also gonna give some margin bottom of 20 pixels to each one. Actually, I might want to make that margin top just so the top row is actually away from the seat available thing. But so now each of them has default styling. Interesting note, by the way. This is something that a lot of people don't catch. This font is not actually the same as man wrote. For some reason, I do not know why, but you actually need to specify, I think so, maybe oh wait, never mind. That is the right font. There's a couple elements where like the all selector doesn't actually select that text, it doesn't update that text, and it's weird. But that looks, I'm glad it's working now, that looks good. Okay, so the other thing we want to do is we want to add a little bit of a border radius to these. Let's just say 5 pixels. And then what I really want to do is make sure that I'm going to show some nifty styling stuff here, is in this form row. So left main form row. These are already, oh wait, did I already target this? I did not already target this, but I can do a display of flex. Inputs oftentimes will, this is a whole other can of worms I'm not going to open right now, but like they're already next to each other even though we haven't done a flex direction of row. It has to do with the way that they're rendered on the page. But just so we're used to how we style stuff, we're going to do a display flex direction of row on this row. And let's say justify content, space between. Now they're on the opposite sides. But this is an interesting thought question, right? So we know there's 20 pixels between here. Visually, we want there to be 20 pixels between here. So, and we also know that there's 10 pixels of padding in between here and here. So we need to figure out the width to set the inputs in this div to make the remaining space be 20 pixels. And so what we're going to do is we can actually target the left main form row, the inputs in here, and we can give them a width. And there's this function called calc. And what this is going to do is it's going to calculate how much width we want these objects to be. And so we want to start with it being 50%, right? But if we were just to say 50%, these are going to overlap and be too little. Each element we're going to want to be minus 10 to make this total width of 20. Right? Wrong. The reason why is this padding needs to get taken under consideration. So this padding is extra width. And so we want to also account for that 10 pixels of padding on each element tag. And so instead of minus 10, we're going to want to set it to be minus 20. Now these are spaced correctly.
Reed, is there ever any merit to putting a blank div with just a height, or sorry, a width of like 20 pixels in between that and flex it all?
You could. A rule of thumb, it's an alternative approach. A lot of times if you have empty HTML tags, it's more of a stylistic thing. If like, you could, there's a common HTML tag called span, which a lot of times span will indicate that there's no content in there as like a readability thing. But you could have done that as well and just set that to be 20 pixels. It's arguably a better approach, actually. This is how I usually do it, but that's a great way that you could do it as well. The other thing I noticed, I don't want this taking up the full box width. So I'm going to come back into my left main form here, and I'm going to set its width, let's just say to be 75%. That's going to only take up 75% of the total box. I'm also going to give this a margin top, maybe 40 pixels. That looks a little bit better. I think might do like 25 actually. I also noticed that the font size here needs to be bigger in my opinion. I don't know about 18. 18 might be a little bit, that looks pretty good. I'll keep it. I think that looks pretty good. Last thing we need to do is to actually style the button. And this should be pretty simple to what we've seen before. But we really just want to, in this button, the dot left main form button, we want its background color to be black. We want it to be display flex. We want it to have a border radius. Let's see how we're already looking. We're looking pretty good. We want, so flex, another thing about flex is it defaults makes the width of all of its elements 100%. There's a thing you can do with width called fit content. And what this is going to do is it's only going to make the width the amount that that element actually takes up in the flex arrangement. We want to make sure this has a margin top of also 20 pixels to be consistent here. We want the font color to be white. We want to align items center. So now they're in line. And we want to pad, let's just say 30 pixels. No, that's not right. 15 pixels, 25 pixels. Let's just see how that looks. That might be a little much. Actually, I want to make the height 60 because I want it to be the same amount as the inputs. And instead, I'm only going to add padding. So I'm not going to add any vertically. I'm just going to add 20 left and right. Last thing that I'm going to do is the left main form, the button image. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and I'm going to add margin left to it so it's a little bit separated from the actual text. And I think in our mockup, I actually added a little bit more space than the 20 pixels on top of this button to make it kind of stand out. So let's say double that to 40. Now this is looking similar to what the mockup had. Last thing for today, we're not going to get into responsive design, but I want to show some additional modifiers, right? So right now, if we were to hover over this button, and this is one of the most common things you'll want to do, you know how like most of the times when you like click on a, like hover over a button, like it changes color, maybe your cursor is different, like this just doesn't even look like it's clickable. So what we can do is we can take this same selector and give it a hover property. So this is a colon hover, right, no spaces after the button. And in here, so this is going to only apply these styles whenever this button is being hovered. And let's just see what happens if we set a background color of yellow. We come over here, we hover, and now its background is yellow. If we were to take this off, it's no longer yellow. I think what'll look good is if we do like a light gray maybe. I think that looks pretty good. And then the other thing we want to do is there's this property called cursor pointer. This is what's actually going to make it look clickable. So it's going to change the cursor to be the hand pointer. And that looks like it's actually interactable now. Okay, a couple minor cleanup things just before we're done. The left main, I think, actually needs a little bit more padding. 60 might be a little too much. I think 50 is probably pretty good. And then the last thing, I promise last thing that I'm going to show is that right now, if I scroll down, like it's scrolling because of the right container, right? Like the left container is not the problem, it's the right container. So what we want to do is we want to make only the right-hand thing like scroll, in a sense. We don't want the whole body to scroll, we only want the right-hand thing to scroll. And so what we want to do is we come over to right, we haven't defined its height, so the body is just expanding to fit the height of this element, right? So if we were to say the height is, I'm going to do 80 VH. This means basically 80% height. View height, 80 view. VHs are better than percents for heights. If I come over here, I actually don't know if it's taking up. It should be taking up that amount. What I want to do is I want to set an overflow of scroll. And what this is going to do is it's going to tell the body, hey, don't take up the whole space for this container. Make the scroll thing inside of this container itself. The other thing we'll notice is that it has its own little like the X scroll, what we don't want. So I think if you go overflow dash Y scroll, overflow dash Y scroll, overflow X hidden. Okay. But wait, that's not looking right now either. Now it looks cut off.
I think you gotta add padding, I think.
Let's try it. If we add 20 pixels of padding. There we go. Look at that. It was because, so I think what was happening is the scroll bar actually counts as width. And so it was cutting off that like 5 pixels that the scroll bar takes up. Now when we look at it, if we just try and scroll, nothing needs to scroll because everything is contained within the body, except now we can actually scroll over the plane and only the plane will scroll. Okay, I know we covered a lot today. I know we went pretty fast today. I hope this shows you the power of CSS, a lot of new exposure to different techniques. Next week we'll be on GitHub, and I'll show a little bit of responsive design, and then the first major personal project will be started next week as well. I'll stick around for a few minutes for any questions. Other than that, have a great week, great weekend, and we'll see you next week.